Kirby, the king of suck. How was he created? And how was he named? What are the development stories behind the game? And most importantly, what's happening in this Kirby lore that everyone is saying is so deep? So let's start from the beginning of the series. Grab a snack, kick back, and let's head back in time. Kirby's debut appearance was in the Game Boy classic Kirby's Dreamland, released to the world in 1992. Kirby's Dreamland introduces us to the land of Dreamland. You all know I love to get my lore directly from the instructions booklet, so let's dig a little deeper. On a tiny star somewhere far, far away from Earth, they don't call it Pop Star just yet, there's a very special place known as Dreamland. The Dreamlanders are very happy people who use their magical sparkling stars to play and work among the heavens. That is until one dark night, when the gluttonous King Dedede, DDD? Day. So in the West we pronounce it DDD, and in Japan it's actually Dedede, but I'll be saying DDD. I'll stick to the American version. So let's move on. The gluttonous King DDD and his rotten band of thieves swooped down from the neighboring Mount DDD for a midnight snack in Dreamland. Not only did they steal all their food, but they stole the Dreamlanders' treasured sparkling stars as well. And because the Dreamlanders didn't have the sparkling stars to gather food anymore, they began to get very hungry. Suddenly, a spry little boy named Kirby happened along and said,
"Don't worry, I'll get your food and your sparkling stars back."
That's my Kirby voice. With these words, Kirby set off on his quest toward the dreaded Mount DDD. We wish him luck. We wish him luck? It's like whoever wrote this wanted nothing to do with this situation. Anyway, the stage is set and Kirby goes off on his very first adventure to thwart this King DDD fellow and bring the food back to Dreamland. So that's more or less the plot, but what about the gameplay? Kirby's Dreamland is a 2D platforming adventure where the objective is to get Kirby to the end of each level. Just don't die along the way. Kirby has the ability to fly, exhale really hard to defeat enemies, and yes, he can suck. This move is Kirby's primary weapon, allowing him to spit enemies back out as a star bullet to destroy obstacles or other enemies. Let's not forget that my guy can just swallow enemies whole so they can suffer a gruesome death, slowly being digested in his pink gastric fluids. But with this being the first title in the series, you'll find a very crucial gameplay mechanic is missing. Kirby's copy ability. Yeah, his trademark move is absent, which makes this game very hard to go back to once you've experienced the rest of the series. But Kirby must travel to 5 different areas in Dreamland, reclaiming the sparkling stars from each of King DDD's henchmen, like Wispy Woods, Lololo and Lalala, Kabula, and Krako, all who would make frequent appearances in the series. In fact, a lot of the enemies from this game are still around to this day, like Cappies, the Poppy Brothers, and Scarfies. Yikes. Technically, Lololo and Lalala here are based on characters from another series known as Eggerland that predates Kirby by a few years. It's probably worth doing a video on all these enemy types down the line. Anyway, Kirby will end his journey at Mount DDD, where he'll face off with his new rival King DDD in a wrestling ring. And by the way, his theme always slaps. So after a hard-fought battle, DDD is defeated, and Kirby retrieves the stolen food for the Dreamlanders, and the day is saved. I gotta give them props for the ending execution though. Kirby inflates into this giant balloon and carries DDD's castle all across Dreamland, just dropping food everywhere. This is a guy that's just trying to get the logistics done as quickly as possible. We see the game end with Kirby saying goodbye to the player while the other Dreamlanders cheer him on. We only see their silhouettes here, but I assume these are all supposed to look like him. Which brings up another question, is there a race of Kirbys or is he unique? From what I found, this is kind of debatable still and maybe a better topic to cover in a future video when we start seeing more Kirby clones pop up. But there are a few masked characters within this series who seem to be whatever Kirby is, with Meta Knight being the best example of this. Regardless, it's interesting seeing the shot with all of these Kirby lookalikes. Kirby's Dreamland was a pretty significant title for Nintendo, and as of the recording of this video, the second most successful game in the series behind Kirby and the Forgotten Land for the Nintendo Switch. Behind this cute title is quite an interesting development story, so we'll have to rewind further back to the 1980s. We turn our focus to a tiny Japanese video game development company called HAL Laboratory. Founded in Tokyo in 1980 by a group of friends and computer enthusiasts. They're responsible for developing peripherals and games for personal computers at that time, like the MSX. And the company only had 5 employees, one of them being a single programmer working there part-time, a young engineering university student known as Satoru Iwata. Yeah, this was the man that would become the president of HAL Laboratory, and most famously, the CEO of Nintendo. By the way, Iwata is given a couple reasons as to why the company was called HAL, the first being named after HAL 9000, the rogue AI character and main antagonist from 2001: A Space Odyssey. The other reason Iwata would later claim in an interview, saying they were called HAL because each letter put us one step ahead of IBM. That's pretty damn clever. Once Iwata graduated and became a full-time programmer at HAL in 1983, he'd step up as the company's coordinator of software production, which allowed him to strengthen their relationship with Nintendo and set the company up to ship games for their new home gaming console, the Famicom, also known overseas as the Nintendo Entertainment System. He'd head to Kyoto to ask Nintendo directly to allow HAL to develop softwares for Famicom, to which Nintendo agreed. In 1989, a game designer named Masahiro Sakurai would join HAL at the young age of 19. Though he's more famous now for his dedicated work on the Smash Bros. Series, this would be his humble beginnings in game design. So this bright-eyed, bushy-tailed Sakurai would pitch a new concept for the Game Boy that anyone could enjoy. The title of the concept? Harukaze Popopo, translating to Spring Breeze Popopo, starring a character named Popopo, a cute main character who everyone will love.
This right here is my favorite thing, ever.
That would use their tongue to grab enemies. And while that description sounds a lot like Yoshi, this was still before Super Mario World. But the tongue mechanic would be swapped out with the idea for the character being able to inhale enemies and spit them back out. Another goal Sakurai pitched for the concept is to make the game accessible. For those of you that grew up around this time, I'm sure you remember the crushing difficulty of majority of games on the market, Lion King. So Sakurai went with something more chill, which led to Kirby's ability to hover and fly, allowing the player to spend less time worrying about dying in bottomless pits. Though he was also playing around with the idea of a mechanic for off-screen deaths, where if the player accumulated enough damage, it'd be easier for them to lose a life by being knocked off the screen completely by enemies. So while this mechanic didn't make it to the final game, Sakurai would completely forget about it and come up with the exact same idea for Super Smash Bros. He has a video talking about this on his YouTube channel, diving further into some of these development secrets if you want to check it out. Joining Sakurai to compose music for the Popopo game was Jun Ishikawa, who would be responsible for most Kirby soundtracks from this point on. Limited by the hardware of the Game Boy, Ishikawa had to get creative with his musical style, and placed focus on simple melodies which, in my opinion, define Kirby's friendlier and more casual atmosphere. But this man would run with this style and drop some timeless bangers. So after working on this concept for over a year, HAL Laboratory was getting ready to release this title in late 1991. So viewers, I present to you Twinkle Popo. Yeah, this technically isn't Kirby, but Popopo, a smiling blob that was originally a placeholder sprite to showcase all the game's concepts. But the staff loved him so much that they tweaked him to be the final character. HAL Laboratory would start running advertisements for Twinkle Popo in late 1991, publishing this full piece in the Famitsu magazine and other publications with an attempt to introduce the world to their cute pink character. But despite their efforts, they would only receive 26,000 advance orders for Twinkle Popo. They'd have to go back to the drawing board, and the game was further delayed into 1992. To make matters worse, by that year they were on the verge of bankruptcy, mainly due to a huge economic collapse in Japan that occurred in the early 90s, and also from the high cost of one of their previous games, Metal Slater Glory, known at the time as one of the most expensive Famicom games to develop. So without many options, HAL would consult with Nintendo on what to do next. Enter Shigeru Miyamoto, who at this time was bringing in huge success to Nintendo with Mario and Zelda. His advice to the folks at HAL was that Nintendo could manage the publishing of Twinkle Popo after a much needed retooling. So they would agree to 3 things to improve this title: restructure the game to increase the memory on the cartridge, use that extra space to add a more challenging extra mode, change the name of the title, and the main character. So with the help of Nintendo, the game got a boosted marketing campaign, and the Nintendo of America team would provide some suggestions for a brand new name for the character. We wanted American kids to enjoy this game too, you see. We asked Nintendo of America for their suggestions. Kirby was one of the many that they sent us, and it caught my eye when I first saw it. I remember Gasper was another one. There were lots. Miyamoto has also confirmed several times that Kirby was favored as a choice, since it was also the name of an important lawyer at Nintendo of America, John Kirby. Kirby won Nintendo a major lawsuit with Universal over the rights to the name Donkey Kong back in 1983, which I cover in some detail in my classic Donkey Kong video, so be sure to check that one out too if you haven't. But the other reason they chose this name was the sound of the name Kirby. The other element to the naming is that the character is very cute. Kirby is this soft and fluffy character, and he's very cute. In Japan, for cute characters, they use very soft names with soft sounds in them. I thought the name Kirby had these harsh sounds to it, and I thought the juxtaposition of this cute character with this harsh sounding name was very funny. So with that, Popopo was now Kirby, which led to the new Japanese name for the title, Hoshi no Kabi, or Kirby of the Stars, debuting in Japan in April 1992. Later that year, it would see its international release as Kirby's Dreamland. The game would be a major success, topping the Game Boy sales charts both in Japan and the United States, moving over 1.3 million copies within a year. As for Satoru Iwata, he would be appointed as the new president of HAL Laboratory, a condition suggested by Nintendo who would help pull HAL out of their financial troubles. Iwata has said in an interview that he turned to everyone at HAL and said, "Okay, from here on out, every game we create is gonna sell 1 million copies," which was the first step in boosting morale and changing the mindset of the developers. But there is a lot of work to be done to improve their situation. Of course, they would continue to build on the success of Kirby's Dreamland and the Kirby character himself, with Sakurai continuing to lead the efforts. So how could they improve this formula?
星のカービィがファミコンソフトになった。すっごくカラフル。ますますやんちゃ。星のカービィ、夢の泉の物語。
Kirby's Adventure, the groundbreaking follow-up to Kirby's Dreamland developed for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1993, alternatively known as Kirby of the Stars, the Story of the Fountain of Dreams in Japan. This was the game that truly established the Kirby playstyle we're used to this day. Masahiro Sakurai would return to direct, with Satoru Iwata, Shigeru Miyamoto, and Takao Shimizu serving as the game's producers. The most obvious new addition to this game is Kirby's famous copy ability. Kirby can now inhale certain enemies that, when swallowed, give Kirby their abilities for him to use himself. This gives Kirby 24 unique abilities at his disposal, making this title an insane improvement over the first. All of his abilities to hover, inhale, and breathe hard on enemies to brutally murder them make a return in this game, but Kirby's overall mobility has also improved, with him now having the ability to dash and slide. But not only that, Kirby is now officially pink in-game. As for the story, Kirby has an even more sinister threat to face this time around. The manual has 4 full pages of story here, so you know shit's going down in Dreamland. Light years away from Earth on a tiny star, we return to Dreamland, a peaceful place once again filled with cute little inhabitants that just eat, sleep, and play. There's an interesting little nugget of world building here. The manual says that Dreamlanders have naps after lunch, and when they awaken, they discuss their dreams with one another and hope that each other's fondest wishes come true. Definitely give some context to the name Dreamland. You guys definitely need to read some of these old manuals because it took me 32 years to find out what the actual Legend of Zelda was. Alex, plug that video, you remember the one. Anyway, our hero Kirby awakens from one of his naps, shocked that he didn't have any dreams at all. And after checking with other Dreamlanders, he finds out it wasn't just him. All the dreams have stopped. This can only mean one thing. Something must have happened to the Dream Spring. The Dream Spring, or the Fountain of Dreams, is a magical well that serves as a reservoir for all the dreams in Dreamland. These dreams flow out of the spring and grant all the sleeping beings enjoyable dreams. I'm actually getting flashbacks to Doki Doki Panic. This sounds exactly like the dream machine that Ward hijacks to give the citizens of the dream world nightmares. Forget the Mario series, Ward should make a return in the Kirby series, it would be perfect. So anyway, the manual tells us that the Dream Spring is given energy by the Star Rod, a magical scepter that has a fragment of an actual star embedded in its tip. So with all of the people of Dreamland now lacking dreams, it's obvious that the spring has been tampered with. So Kirby heads there to investigate, only to find King DDD bathing in its waters.
So you're up to your old tricks again? Hey, DDD?
Kirby racially profiles DDD, who tries to explain that he is trying to do everyone a favor by breaking apart the Star Rod and giving the pieces to his friends. Officer Kirby doesn't let him finish and runs off to go arrest all of his friends. And by arrest, I mean kill. And so begins Kirby's adventure, and this time there are 7 major worlds, each with 1 major boss and 7 stages within them. Enemies from Kirby's Dreamland return like Wispy Woods and Kracko. I feel weird saying that. But we have some new additions too, like Mr. Shine and Mr. Bright. But most importantly, we see the introduction of Meta Knight, a recurring enemy, rival, and friend in the Kirby series, as well as his band of misfits, the Meta Knights. In this game, Meta Knight is allied with King DDD, guarding a piece of the Star Rod, so Kirby must pick up a sword and take him on in an honorable battle of blades. I always think these fights are so badass, it's always a thrill to fight Meta Knight in these games. So with all of DDD's friends thwarted, Kirby goes to fight the big man himself, and after a little scrap, Kirby is once again victorious. There we go, Kirby. You've returned peace to Dreamland. Oh my god, it's a plot twist. So DDD took the Star Rod to prevent the world from being shrouded in darkness from this sinister force named Nightmare, an entity that took root in the Dream Spring. So Kirby messed everything up, and almost in a petty way, DDD swallows him and launches him into the sky after Nightmare to go handle his fuck up. We've reached the final boss of the game, with Nightmare first taking the form of a dark orb. Equipped with the Star Rod, Kirby blasts this sucker out the sky, forcing him to transform into his true wizard form. And just as an aside, for the NES, Nightmare's animations are top notch. So with the help of the Star Rod, Kirby eliminates Nightmare, and the ending explains DDD's true intentions of helping the people out. Kirby waves goodbye to him and returns the rod to the Dream Spring, bringing back dreams to Dreamland. And so with the days saved, this closes out one of Kirby's greatest adventures. Can you believe Sakurai and his team made this game in a year? Yeah, even though Nintendo helped bail out HAL Laboratory and Iwata was busy whipping the company into shape, they still needed to earn some profits to pay off their debts. So leaning into a Kirby sequel seemed like their best bet. This game was developed for the NES, 2 years into the life cycle of the more powerful Super Nintendo, but they opted for the older console since the company didn't have time to set up the development environment for the Super Nintendo. But this time, Sakurai would make a greater effort to appeal to both new and more seasoned players, and came up with a copy ability to add more depth to his game. They came up with a total of 40 different concepts for copy abilities, but trimmed it down to the final 25, which is still a major undertaking in my opinion. Sakurai also has a video regarding the development of Kirby's Adventure, and regarding this game he says, quote, "Development was stressful for a lot of reasons, and it really did a number on my stomach. But I think the end product holds its own against the many other titles in the NES library." Now I won't go too deep into it in this video, but Kirby's Adventure got an amazing remake for the Game Boy Advance in 2002, called Nightmare in Dreamland in the West. I will never forget the jingle they came up with for this commercial. So this game was overhauled with brand new graphics, redone music, and a new gameplay engine. And I know the purists in the comments section are going to jump on me for this one, but this remake is much better than the original in every single way. I mean, look at the glow up on Nightmare. The original Kirby's Adventure was warmly received by reviewers who all agreed that the brand new mechanics made it a worthy sequel. And while it wasn't as successful in sales as Kirby's Dreamland, Kirby would be sticking around for years to come. So what was next for HAL Laboratory and Kirby? They had all this debt to pay off, so they needed another banger. Kirby's Pinball. I know that may have come off as a joke, but this is a damn good pinball game. There's not much to say about this plot-wise, but it holds some significance in the series as the first Kirby spin-off game. Releasing to the world in winter 1993 for the Game Boy, the player would simply play pinball on 3 different boards based on the environments from Kirby's Dreamland. You'd use the flippers to knock a ball version of Kirby around, but what made this so cool was that each board had 3 floors to navigate. It's like one of those clubs with a different DJ on each level, but for this game, the objective was to get Kirby into VIP on the top of each board. The game consists of Wispy Woods Lands, Krakow Land, and Poppy Brothers Land, but what's even cooler is that at the top of each board, you have to fight a boss from Kirby's Dreamland. I always loved games that did this. It always made pinball feel more rewarding and just more like a video game. So the bosses are obviously Wispy Woods, Krakow, and the Poppy Brothers, but once you've cleared all 3 boards, Kirby will go toe-to-toe with King DDD in the original fighting arena. Once defeated, Kirby closes in to finish off his nemesis once and for all, before getting completely Goomba stomped by one of his henchmen. Everybody runs off screen and the game ends, coaxing the player to start all over again. You're probably asking yourself why HAL decided on pinball. Or maybe not, it doesn't take much to just roll Kirby up into a ball and throw him into a pinball game. HAL developed 3 other pinball titles in the past. Pinball for the NES, Rollerball, and Revenge of the Gator. Your guess is as good as mine for that last one. But they took what they learned from these titles and used Kirby as the backdrop. And if this game looks familiar to you but you can't quite put your finger on it, HAL Laboratory would be responsible for Pokemon Pinball for the Game Boy Color, which was heavily influenced by Kirby's Pinball Land. And to close out this segment of Kirby's history, Iwata did successfully turn HAL Laboratory around. leading the company to fully pay off their 1.5 billion yen debt to Nintendo by 1999. Alex, adjust that amount for inflation, now converted to US dollars. $11 million paid off in approximately 6 years. It's no wonder Iwata was sent a warm invitation to join Nintendo, and eventually would serve as one of its most memorable CEOs. Much like Donkey Kong and Mario, I look at Kirby as another character developed from the mind of a visionary who, despite the stresses of financial downfalls and potential failure, wanted to put a smile on the faces of people that played his game. This passion, work ethic, and attention to detail is apparent in all of Sakurai's work, and ultimately made this cute pink puff a force to be reckoned with. This is Kirby's Dream Course, and it's ridiculously fun. Forget Mario Party, if you're competitive enough, this game will make you hate your friends even more. Released in late 1994 in Japan and early 1995 in the US, Kirby's Dream Course would be the Super Nintendo debut for the God of Guzzling.
Yeah, boy.
But did you know that Kirby's Dream Course was initially designed as a game titled Special T-Shot? Back in 1992, Special T-Shot was a golf-style game developed by Nintendo, complete with its own original characters. But this game would be put on pause for a bit until Nintendo decided to bring in HAL Laboratory to repurpose the game's framework with their new widely popular character, Kirby! With the working title Kirby's T-Shot, this game would begin Kirby's Super Nintendo era. A significant time for him with 3 new mainline titles, 5 spin-offs, and a cancelled game called Kid Kirby developed by a young dev team in Scotland that would evolve into Rockstar North. Yes, I mean Grand Theft Auto Rockstar. But I'll set that project aside for the following video. Today we'll take a journey back to the 90s to explore the Kirby titles and spin-offs around the age of the Super Nintendo. Taking place after the Fountain of Dreams incident in Kirby's Adventure, Kirby's Dream Course begins with a peaceful day in Dreamland. Oh, you thought this game wouldn't have a story? Take a walk with me. The citizens of Dreamland have returned to their lazy lifestyles, gazing up into the night sky as they admire the stars. But one night, all the stars in the sky begin to vanish, driving the Dreamlandians into a state of collective depression. So just like the last 2 games, they don't know what to do with themselves, but Kirby notices something with his telescope. King DDD is the one up there taking the stars away, and in a panic after noticing Kirby was noticing him, DDD races off, dropping a star in the process, leading Kirby into a hot pursuit. The stage is set, so let's stop DDD by playing some f***ing golf. Kirby is your ball, and you'll have to guide him through 8 major courses within Kirby's Dream Course. The objective is to accurately whack him into all of the enemies on the map. Doing this reveals the final hole, and once Kirby rolls inside, you're off to the next level. I compared this to golf before, but this has a few other games baked into it, like billiards and bowling, for instance. And they even implemented Kirby's signature copy powers, allowing players to implement these abilities into their shots, like the high jump power, fireball, or parasol. But if there's one thing I'll say about this game, the physics feel top-notch. With each shot that you take, you can feel Kirby's weight through the sound effects and the way he bounces and rolls on this terrain. It's really satisfying, especially when your skill level starts to improve throughout the game. This game also boasts quite an ambitious competitive multiplayer mode, making this the very first game in the series to include multiplayer. Play alongside a friend and they'll get to play as a yellow version of Kirby, who was internally named Kibi by the developers. Kibi combines the word Kiro, meaning yellow in Japanese, and Kirby. And this wasn't supposed to be a separate character. The manual addresses this as Kirby just being yellow for player 2. But as of 2022, within Kirby's Dream Buffet, Kibi makes an official cameo on one of the collectible character treats named Kirby and Kibi, the first time he'd be officially named as such in a game. So once Kirby rolls his way through all 8 courses, there is a final boss with King DDD, who pulls up Eggman style in a giant robot called Robo DDD. Launch Kirby at his head a few times and you'll make quick work of this thing, and in turn, cure the depressed Dreamlanders by returning the stolen stars to the sky. It's actually impressive how much content is packed into this game, and if you have yet to try it out, play it one time with a friend and see what you think. It's available on the Nintendo Switch. But you'd think with the release of Kirby's Dream Course, Special T-Shot would never see the light of day. But in fact, Nintendo did end up putting it out to the world in some form. A title for the Satellaview in 1996. The Satellaview is a peripheral exclusively made for the Super Famicom in Japan. And I've talked about it a few times before on this channel, both for Zelda and Mario, but this was a device where players were able to receive data through satellite transmissions directly to their Super Famicom system, which I guess could be looked at as a very, very early version of live service content that we see today. Special T-Shot would be exclusive to the Satellaview, keeping all of the original content but having more or less the same mechanics as Kirby's Dream Course. But just because Kirby was stripped from this game doesn't mean he never made an appearance on the Satellaview. I give you Kirby's Toy Box. I'm getting a little ahead of myself chronologically since this hit the market in 1996, but Kirby's Toy Box was a series of traditional games featuring Kirby that would be broadcast directly to the player's system. Depending on the time the player connected to the network via their Satellaview, a different game would be available for them to play. There's no story to discuss in the game this time, but let's take a look at some of these mini-games. Baseball is self-explanatory. The player will hit ball Kirby with a baseball bat in hopes of lining it up into the slots on the back of the field. There's actually a 2-player mode for this game as well. Pinball is pinball, with Kirby serving as the ball yet again. While the board itself is somewhat plain, it does have a few recognizable enemies from the series like King Dedede, Kracko, and Waddle Dee. Starbreak is a breakout style game with Kirby as the ball and 2 Ricks as the paddle. And I haven't even formally introduced Rick yet, but I guess we'll get to him shortly. Round and Round Ball is where the game names start to get a little bit more obscure, but the player will shoot Kirby at different speeds into a tube, attempting to drop him into holes deeper within the spiral. The further the hole, the more points you collect. Cannonball stars a giant Robo-Rick who shoots Kirby's at the Robo-Rick on the other side of the mountain until it's defeated. This is meant to be a 2-player game, but this also has the option of having a CPU as your opponent. A Range Ball has the player attempt to land Kirby into 9 different holes on this pegboard, but you have to be strategic because you only have 9 Kirbys to shoot. Anytime I run into Pachinko, I can never wrap my head around what's going on, but it looks like it's here in Kirby's Toy Box as well. The player is given 2 minutes to launch as many Kirbys as they want onto the board, attempting to land in various pockets. There's a Kirby in the center the player can aim to hit as well, which gives a chance at bonus points. And then finally, Ball Rally, a game where the player needs to time their button presses to guide Kirby through an obstacle course. So while there's not much depth to these games, this is Kirby's only presence on the Satellaview, and Kirby's Toy Box would eventually end up as lost media, especially since Nintendo dubbed their Satellaview peripheral a failure. It wouldn't be until 2016, 20 whole years later, where a group of preservationists managed to get their hands on a few of these mini-games and upload them online to be emulated. More games would be uncovered by a different group at an auction in Japan and uploaded that same month. Finally, Ball Rally was the last minigame to be rediscovered in December 2020, uploaded online by a member of the Satellaview research blog, Satellablog. Now I know these games may seem simple, but as time goes on, we're gonna lose more and more games like this to obscurity. It's good that these preservationists take the time to rediscover this stuff and upload it for everybody to see. So major props to them for keeping these titles alive. So with Kirby ingraining himself as a mainstay Nintendo character, it was time for a mainline Kirby title to arrive on the Super Nintendo. But first, there was Kirby's Avalanche.
He made me and my friend play this game, Avalanche, and he'd dump all these little blobs on me. And the only way that I could survive was if I buried my buddy in boulders.
Oh, look, he's a cutie. Is this the guy?
Many puzzle game enthusiasts now know that this game is basically that Japanese puzzle game Puyo Puyo in disguise. The concept is pretty simple. Match Puyo by colors, get 4 in a row, and you clear them from your side of the screen. Clear enough and you'll send garbage Puyos to the other side to take up space on your opponent's side of the screen. But this simple mechanic allows you to make some crazy combos that can cause utter frustration in a competitive setting. Little known fact about me, this is my favorite puzzle game and I'm actually really good at it.
Cool.
Developed by Compile in the early 90s, Puyo Puyo was its own puzzle spin-off to an RPG in Japan known as Mado Monogatari, which had its original set of lore and characters that would also star in Puyo Puyo. So when Compile wanted to release their Sega Mega Drive version to an international audience, Sega made the marketing decision to remove all the Mado Monogatari cast and replace them with Dr. Robotnik and his minions from the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog TV series running at that time. And so we got Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine in 1993, and as a kid from that time, this marketing decision worked on me. But Nintendo would also jump on this idea with the Super Nintendo release of Super Puyo Puyo being reskinned to make Kirby's Avalanche, or as they know it in Europe, Kirby's Ghost Trap. Neither Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine or Kirby's Avalanche would be released in Japan, making them the first Western exclusive Sonic and Kirby titles to hit the market. But I don't blame Nintendo and HAL for slapping Kirby on the front of all these spin-offs. It's a decent business decision. But you guessed it, this game has a story. We return to Dreamland once again, discovering that its citizens have a local pastime called Avalanche, a puzzle game that looks a lot like Puyo Puyo. So when they're not sleeping and watching stars all day, the Dreamlanders are practicing to be the Avalanche champion at the first annual Dreamland's Avalanche competition. With this being the biggest event in the history of Dreamland, everyone will travel by foot to the Dream Fountain, and if one Dreamlander happens to stumble upon another, they must face off in an avalanche match. The winner is the one who can continue forward, leading to the final matches at the Dream Fountain. Kirby decides to take part in this event as well, which is more or less what happens during the events of the game as you stumble upon a ton of enemies from the Kirby franchise like Waddle Dees, Wispy Woods, Kracko, Meta Knight, and as you probably guessed, the final match is with King DDD. I think this is the only game where Kirby speaks in complete sentences.
Oh, I'm so scared.
So for those of you keeping score, at this stage of the Kirby game, that is 2 mainline titles and 3 spin-off games. So I guess at this point, it's about time that Nintendo and HAL made a mainline title for the Super Nintendo, right? Kirby's Dreamland 2 for the Game Boy. Yeah, instead we got a sequel to the game that started it all. The naming convention here had me curious if the Kirby games had some ridiculous timeline thing going on like Zelda, Sonic, and to a certain extent Mario, and I stumbled upon this. So I'm not even gonna try to make sense of this image yet, so let's just enjoy the ride. But what I've uncovered about this game is that it would be the very first entry in what's known as the Dark Matter Trilogy. So Kirby's Dreamland 2 has a new enemy arise from the shadows. Dark Matter, another entity of darkness, steals the rainbows that connect the Rainbow Islands of Dreamland and attempts to cover the world in darkness. Dark Matter possesses King DDD as well to assist him in his evil deeds, which has Kirby step up once again to save Dreamland. Kirby this time is joined by 3 brand new animal friends, Rick the hamster, Kind the fish, and Ku the owl, each giving Kirby unique abilities to help him on his adventure. But let's not forget Gooey.
Hi.
He'll pop out of bags where the animal friend should be if Kirby already has that respective animal. So Gooey just heals Kirby instead. This may seem minor, but Gooey will be more important later. Just know that he exists right now. These animal friends spawn from the idea of Kirby originally riding around in a tank, some kind of submersible, and a rocket ship or UFO. You can see all of these in the original concept art, but they were scrapped in place of the animal friends. But all of these would eventually get some kind of representation in the series, most prominently in Kirby and the Rainbow Curse. Much like Kirby's Dreamland, Dreamland 2 is a traditional platformer with Kirby having his basic moveset to inhale, swallow, and fly. But this time, elements from Kirby's adventure carried over into this game, like the copy ability. But unlike its predecessor, Dreamland 2 only has 7 abilities. But just because there's less doesn't mean they weren't cooking with this game. Kirby can combine his copy powers with these animal friends to not only increase the damage of their attacks, but change up the style of attack as well. So while there are only 7 copy abilities, there are a total of 21 different combinations that can be explored here. So during Kirby's new adventure with his animal best buds, they'll travel to 7 unique locations on the Rainbow Islands, each with their own set of stages and a boss that must be defeated to get to the next island. We see familiar bosses from previous games like Wispy Woods, who seem to have caught the plague this time around, Mr. Shine and Mr. Bright, Kracko, and of course King DDD. Once Kirby and his friends have braved the Rainbow Islands, it's time to face King DDD at the Dark Castle. The player can head right in and give DDD a proper beatdown, which leads the whole gang to head home in the rain and call it a day. But wait a second. The end? I guess we assume if you do things this way, Dark Matter ended up plunging the world into darkness. So to get the real ending, the goal is to find the hidden rainbow drops on each island as you play through the game, encouraging the player to explore the worlds and collect all 7 like Chaos Emeralds. Challenge DDD once again with all the rainbow drops, and Kirby will assemble the Rainbow Sword, which summons Dark Matter out of hiding, and the two take their fight into space, where they engage in this epic cosmic sword fight. Kirby makes quick work of him, but this is a Kirby game. There has to be 2 forms.
Hi.
Now after Dark Matter shows his true form, Kirby can finally destroy him with his Rainbow Sword, bringing peace back to Dreamland as his animal friends and DDD look up into the sky. The credits roll with Kirby doing cute little air tricks and waving at the player. It's adorable. But in the final shot, we see Kirby restore the rainbow bridges with his new sword. So as someone who's just starting to dive deep into the Kirby lore and like the Kirby games, I assumed that this ridiculous sword would make another appearance down the line in like future games. It doesn't. What happened? But like the Star Rod in previous Kirby titles, this sword will continue the trend of Kirby having some kind of final weapon handy at the end of each game. Okay, so Kirby's Dreamland 2 launched in March 1995. That means the Super Nintendo's been out 5 years at this point. So is it finally time for that mainline Super Nintendo Kirby game? Kirby's Block Ball. More like Kirby's Blue Ball, am I right? Another spin-off title, this time for the Game Boy. Kirby is slapped on another style of puzzle game, Breakout. But I'd be doing this game a disservice if I said it was just a reskinned puzzle game. This is definitely much more elaborate than Starbreak from Kirby's Toy Box, and actually has quite a few things going for it. King DDD is up to no good and steals the 5 sparkling stars again, so to get them back, Kirby must fight his way up through each stage to reach DDD in his castle. There are 10 worlds in total, and Kirby once again decides to flex and save Dreamland in ball form. If you've played Breakout before, it's pretty much that. But if you time your button presses when Kirby lands on the paddles, you'll return to full size and do more damage to blocks and enemies. Not only will Kirby have to take on bosses in this format, he can copy abilities as well when he defeats the right enemies, allowing him to use Burn, Needle, Spark, and Stone powers. There's even bonus mini games in here that you can play like Air Hockey, Star Catcher, and Up Cloud.
What's Up Cloud?
The polish on this game is no coincidence though. It was the team at Nintendo R&D 1 who oversaw this project. The same team that famously made Super Mario Land 1 and 2 and the Wario Land series. And they would develop this game in collaboration with Tosei, who is known for the legendary Starfy series. But that doesn't mean HAL wasn't involved either. Back in 2011, Satoru Iwata would interview one of the developers who worked on Kirby's Block Ball, Hitoshi Yamagami, who stated, "About 15 years ago, I worked on Kirby's Block Ball. At first, HAL Laboratory said it wasn't like Kirby. In the end, we spent about half a year on a major overhaul. They gave me thorough instruction on every aspect of Kirby's movement." To which Iwata replied, "Yes, I remember." So for extra context, Iwata was president at HAL Laboratory when Kirby's Block Ball was developed, helping the company pull themselves out of debt, no doubt. But I go into that story in a little bit more detail in my last Kirby video if you're curious to hear about that. So after Kirby has annihilated most of DDD's minions, the second to last boss Kirby will face in this game is Brobo, who looks like a relative of Kirby in a robot suit. The interesting thing about this fight is that if you defeat Brobo without meeting all the borderline scores in all 10 stages of this game, you get a bad ending. Kirby will just decide to go home without finding DDD. So you play again and get all the correct scores in each stage, and now you're able to face King DDD. You'll be hacking away at him for some time, but once defeated, Kirby can retrieve the sparkling stars, and what I think is the Dream Fountain is under DDD's castle? Did he manage to move a whole fountain there? Are there multiple Dream Fountains in Dreamland? Let me finish all the games before I start theorizing. Speaking of all the games, when are we finally getting to that mainline Super Nintendo title? It must exist.
Kirby-chan! Kirby-chan! Super Deluxe Kirby-chan!
Kirby Super Star, the first mainline Kirby game for the Super Nintendo. This was my entry point into the series many years ago, and personally is still one of my favorites. HAL Laboratory took a different approach this time around, structuring the game in an omnibus format, where the player can select from a set of 6 unique adventures for Kirby. These are all mostly self-contained stories with slightly different gameplay mechanics, and while only 4 are available to the player at the start of the game, the rest can be unlocked by completing the others. So let's start with the simplest, Spring Breeze. This game is a rehash of Kirby's Dreamland, with King DDD and his minions stealing all of the food from Dreamland. While it's a little bit more condensed than the original game, it was created as a short set of levels to introduce the updated gameplay style from Kirby Super Star, most of which carried over from Kirby's Adventure. This includes the dash, slide, and of course the copy ability, but now his appearance changes depending on the power. But wait a sec, what's this? Kirby can create a helper from his copy abilities? And a friend can take control of this helper? Nah, this is a 10 out of 10 game. And while the helper is limited to the power Kirby gives it, this was still a pretty big deal. It was cool in Sonic 2, but let's be real, Tails was just there to give your little sibling something to do. This here was true cooperative gameplay. The major bosses from the original make a return with these fancy new graphics, with Kirby once again humbling Wispy Woods, Lololo and Lalala, and Krako. Poor Kabbalah here got scrapped. But as is tradition, Kirby will scale mount DDD to take on King DDD in his boxing ring once again, recreating the moment of their very first dance. Oh, and look, Mario and his friends pulled up to watch this time. So after DDD's defeat, the ending plays out just like Kirby's Dreamland, with Kirby using the sparkling stars to transform into a giant balloon to spread the missing food across Dreamland. I joked about this throughout the video, but this game took some time for a reason. It would be 3 years since Kirby's Adventure, and while there were several Kirby games in between, this was the next project from Masahiro Sakurai, the creator of Kirby, the director and main designer of Kirby's Dreamland and Kirby's Adventure, and the one who would go on to create the Super Smash Bros. Series. Shortly after the release of Kirby's Adventure in 1993, they began development of Kirby Super Star soon after. And there were 3 major objectives Sakurai had in mind for this game, the first being 2-player cooperative gameplay, an idea requested by the great Shigeru Miyamoto. Miyamoto realized that cooperative gameplay wasn't often seen in platforming games at that time, and while he wanted to incorporate this into the Super Mario franchise, it wouldn't fully come to fruition until New Super Mario Bros. Wii in 2009. But with Kirby's slower gameplay style, Sakurai took on the challenge, coming up with the helpers that I mentioned earlier. The second objective was to include mechanics from fighting games. Don't get me started on how fun it is using Fighter Kirby. Oh my gosh, you feel so ridiculous and powerful. It's like one of my favorite abilities of all time. It's so great. But the implementation of fighting mechanics goes beyond just that. All the copy abilities have these little movesets that give them more variety, and Sakurai also decided to make enemies more durable to factor in the presence of the helper. The final objective was the omnibus format of the game, an idea Sakurai cooked up to create multiple segments within one game that delivered a variety of stories and styles of gameplay to keep things fresh for players. With all this in mind, development took 3 years, which may not seem like much now, but just to put it in perspective, Kirby got his first mainline Super Nintendo title 3 months prior to the release of the Nintendo 64. Sakurai has stated that the groundbreaking CG graphics from Donkey Kong Country had something to do with this. There are various reasons that development dragged on, but one was the influence of Donkey Kong Country. Midway through development, it was decided that we should incorporate computer graphics, so we threw out the art we made up to that point. Of course, I could have refused to do it, but I was certain myself that there would be merits to using CG, so I don't feel it was forced on me. Rather, I feel like it happened at just the right time. So let's head back into this story with the next game, Dynablade, a giant cyborg bird that has metal wings. The intro is only a few seconds, with Kirby's nap being interrupted by a strong gust from Dynablade, so I'll defer to the manual for the true story here. A strange bird named Dynablade has come from the mountain and ruined the crops. Unless Kirby can stop him, Dreamland will be devastated. Alright Kirby, so let's go kill off the local wildlife. Gameplay is pretty straightforward here, and in my opinion, this is the story where the game truly begins. Kirby will hop from stage to stage, overcoming the usual obstacles and mini-bosses as he approaches Dynablade's nest. And there's an overworld map here where the player can select the next level, similar to the Super Mario series. And while there's no bosses in this mode to really discuss, there are a couple of cool new mini-bosses introduced in Kirby Super Star, like Chef Kawasaki and Iron Mom. These two introduce the brand new copy abilities Cook and Fighter respectively. I already gushed over the Fighter ability, but Cook is special. A one-time use ability that forces all enemies on screen into Kirby's pot. With everyone cooked alive, Kirby has food items that remain on screen for him to eat.
Yeah, boy.
Once Kirby arrives at Dynablade's nest on Candy Mountain, it's time for the final battle. And you have a few options for copy abilities given to you before the battle begins, so Dynablade isn't too hard to take down. Good work, Kirby. You've slain Dynablade and saved all the farmers' crops. But now we find out that you've slaughtered somebody's mother.
Oh shit!
In his guilt, Kirby takes these chicks home and becomes their foster father, holding Wispy Woods at gunpoint to offer his apples for them to eat, teaching them to fly, and once old enough, he sends them on their way. It's revealed at the very end that Dynablade survived, and I guess after getting assaulted in her own home and having her kids kidnapped, decides that they'll all relocate.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Next up is Gourmet Race, which is a much shorter game in comparison. It begins with Kirby seemingly on a pilgrimage to an orchard filled with food, but once he reaches this orchard, King DDD returns to challenge him to a special gourmet race to see who is the ultimate glutton. The game is structured as a Grand Prix with 3 courses: Pumpkin Grand, Corn Hall, and Onion Garden. The player will dash toward the finish line, picking up food items along the way to increase their score. Get to the finish line first and you get a bonus of 30 points. The one with the most points at the end of all 3 courses wins this challenge. It's pretty simple, but the best thing to come out of this game was this banger right here. While this theme is occasionally associated with King DDD, I'd argue that this song often represents the Kirby series as a whole. It's so good. Jun Ishikawa, who is the primary composer for the Kirby series, has stated that he was told to make a song in the vein of an athletic meet and took inspiration from the orchestral classic Chico's Post. And blended that sound with a ska rhythm, which would culminate into the final song, Gourmet Race. This track has stood the test of time and has been remixed several times throughout the series, so it definitely holds up and is still one of my favorites. The next game is Great Cave Offensive, which puts Kirby in the role as an adventurer. The objective is to explore a large cavern that's split up into 4 major stages, collecting as much treasure as you can find. This mode has 60 treasures in total, and it can be challenging to get them all. Some treasures will be locked behind time challenges, rendering certain items to be completely missable if you don't time your platforming right. Despite its focus on treasure hunting, this mode still has a boss within each stage. Fatty Whale, Computer Virus, Cameleo Arm, and Wham Bam Rock, all brand new enemies making their debut within Kirby Super Star. Get to the end and you'll be able to see every single treasure collected, and if you manage to get all 60, you're greeted with an image of Kirby becoming part of the top 1%. Now before I continue, there was also a scrap game mode initially planned by Sakurai known as Kagero Mansion, dropped due to time constraint. It's like a horror game and was completely different from the usual Kirby game. Kirby finds himself in a mansion and under a curse, sealing his mouth shut. He can't suck in or spit out, so he can't copy. He would go around the mansion and, for example, get a copy ability of fire from a candle. I was planning a horror action game with puzzle elements. Unfortunately, the team didn't get around to developing this, scrapping the idea pretty early in the concept phase. But this sounds extremely interesting to me, considering I have this fascination with creepy scenarios in non-horror games. Sakurai shared more information on the idea for this mode on his YouTube channel back in October 2022. Apparently, Kirby would have chased a butterfly into a dark forest where a sentient wall clock that belonged to a wizard from ages past would have cast the curse that seals his mouth shut. He would also share a concept sketch of the candle Kirby would have gotten his firepower from. Though I'm completely shocked that there's no fan game or a creepypasta fan game that's been made about this yet. Revenge of Meta Knight is the next major game, and as the title suggests, Meta Knight finally steps up as the primary antagonist of this story. This episode begins in a much more cinematic format, with Meta Knight and his crew preparing to launch their airship, the Halberd, to take control of Dreamland, while Kirby here is coming in hot. After this thrilling little cutscene, you're thrown right into this high-octane adventure as Kirby begins his siege on the airship. This opening shows how dangerous Kirby can be, with him obliterating these enemies before the player can even control him. The crew of the Halberd is composed of Meta Knight, the Meta Knights, his minions that debuted in Kirby's Adventure, Captain Vol, the pilot, and Sailor Waddle Dee. And these are the characters that drive the story while Kirby lays waste to the Halberd, as we're able to see their dialogue between one another while playing through the levels. So I always thought that this choice was inspired by Star Fox, where radio comms between the characters entirely drove the narrative, but I haven't found any interviews or direct quotes to support that theory. Either way, the dialogue from these characters adds a great deal of personality to this specific game mode, making it a favorite among fans, and this would also be my favorite of the bunch. This mode also has a time limit, and while it's pretty lenient, it's best to treat this like a time attack and move as quickly as possible. So at the end of the first chapter, Kirby takes on this big mech called Heavy Lobster, which manages to blow Kirby out into the ocean. This allows the crew to take off while Kirby tries to find a way back onto the airship. After a series of trials and tribulations and a couple of boss fights, Kirby manages to snag another warp star to head back to the Halberd. And
Got him! Got him!
well, all hope isn't lost because he falls right back to Candy Mountain, where he'll seek the help of his one-time nemesis, Dynablade.
Please don't hurt my family.
Despite heavy fire from the Halberd, Dynablade manages to drop Kirby off, who spends the rest of this segment tearing the ship apart piece by piece and offing the crew one by one. With its reactor destroyed, the Halberd begins its rapid descent, and the crew begins emergency evacuation. But Kirby and Meta Knight have a score to settle. Meta Knight challenges him to a duel, and Kirby picks up his sword, and the two go at it in this badass sword fight. Man, this was so cool. After an intense battle, Kirby is victorious, slicing Meta Knight's mask in two, and it shows his face is just as adorable.
Hi.
With the Halberd descending quickly, Kirby rushes to the lower level of the ship and finds a wheelie, hopping on its back for one final rush to the end. The ticking clock, the intense music, the high-speed movement, Meta Knight returning with wings to try and stop you. This is all just mwah. Kirby escapes with his new wheelie friend, riding off into the sunset. We'll see Meta Knight again someday, but for now, you've earned your rest, Kirby. Just kidding. Milky Way Wishes is the final main game that's unlocked once all other major stories are completed. Dreamland is once again in crisis. The sun and moon in the sky are fighting, causing it to shift constantly into day and night. As Kirby and other citizens look into the sky, a 100% trustworthy jester named Marks pulls up and tells Kirby that their only hope is to summon the power of a comet called Nova by using the energy of the surrounding planets in the Milky Way.
Yeah.
So with his mission clear, Kirby takes a warp star into space as we leave the planet for the very first time. The gameplay of this story is more or less a combination of everything you've learned up to this point. But as an added gameplay element, Kirby can't just swallow enemies to obtain their powers. In each stage, he must collect special items to get that specific power. But once you collect it, you'll have the ability permanently, and the player can select it at any time. Many of the bosses you face in other stories return in more powerful forms as Kirby visits each planet. So despite all of the resistance, Kirby does successfully collect the energy needed from all 7 planets, and summons Nova as instructed. This thing being considered a comet is wild to me. But just as Mark said, it does offer Kirby one wish. But just before Kirby can speak, Mark shoves him out the way.
Oh, the deception!
And he makes a wish to control Popstar. Actually, this moment is the first time Kirby's entire planet is referred to as Planet Popstar in the series, so I can start calling it that now. But anyway, the situation gets worse with Nova granting Mark's wish, giving him the power to control Popstar while Kirby floats off into space. But this isn't over yet. The stars he collected from the planets come together to form the Starship, Kirby's final power in this game. He heads into Nova to take it down from the inside, with this whole thing turning into an epic shoot 'em up. Like, I'm so happy I get to talk about this. This game has everything. So after destroying Nova's core, it's time to take down Mark's. No long talking. Just jump his ass, Kirby. The battle ends and Kirby sends Mark's flying into Nova. The two collide and explode, bringing peace back to Popstar while the sun and moon return to good terms. As for Kirby, he can finally take that long rest. And that closes the chapter of Kirby Super Star, which personally deserved its own video considering all the content that's packed within this game. There are other modes here like the arena where you can test your skills against all the bosses from the game one after the other. Then there are the 2 mini games, Megaton Punch and Samurai Kirby. Megaton Punch has you timing button presses to see who can leave the biggest crack in the ground. And if you're really good at this, the results get pretty ridiculous. Mario and friends decided to watch this one go down as well. Samurai Kirby focuses on your reaction time, with Kirby facing off an opponent in a showdown. Once this exclamation mark appears, you have to press any button faster than the opponent. And I will say the later enemies like King DDD and Meta Knight are very tricky to beat, but it's extremely satisfying. Funny enough, these 2 minigames were teased in Kirby's Toy Box, which would have aired for the Satellaview on February 22nd, 1996, a couple weeks before the release of Kirby Super Star. Those demo versions of these minigames were lost to time, and I'm sure are still being sought out by preservationists, even if it's identical to the final game. But Kirby Super Star was both a critical and commercial success, with over 1 million copies sold in Japan. HAL Laboratory would revisit the title back in 2008 with Kirby Super Star Ultra for the Nintendo DS, complete with new graphics and game modes, but I'll cover this a little more closely once we get to that era. So what was next after Kirby Super Star? You would figure that after this, there would be a little bit more time before the next major game. But it wasn't time for Kirby to hang up his sleepy hat just yet. Yes, another spin-off puzzle game for Kirby fans to chew on, Kirby Star Stacker for the Game Boy. Released in early 1997, this was a block-based puzzle game that's easy to compare to Tetris, but let me explain. Blocks with Kirby's animal friends will fall from the top of your screen, and the goal is to sandwich the stars on the screen between 2 matching blocks. So keep scoring stars and make sure the blocks don't stack too high. That's the basics of the game. The main game has you playing against DDD, who's mainly there to pound the ground with his fist to add more blocks and laugh at you. Nintendo and HAL decided to release a complete remake of this game exclusively in Japan for the Super Famicom. This time with overhauled graphics, and you guessed it, a story. It's a normal starry night in Dreamland, until an alien named Mr. Star flies past Dreamland while traveling through space. King DDD with his spectacular eye shoots him down with a cannon, gruesomely splitting him apart into several pieces that land across Dreamland. One of them lands on Kirby's head while he's out on some camping trip, but he's quick to figure out that Mr. Star needs help collecting his organs across Dreamland. So Kirby goes on another adventure with his animal friends to beat the enemies that have Mr. Star's pieces. So with this new story comes a whole set of enemies you can now face off against in story mode, which are mostly established characters from the series like Chef Kawasaki, who fully cemented himself into the Kirby roster after his debut. Once Kirby defeats DDD, all of Mr. Star is collected and he heads back into space. But after the credits, there's one surprise boss left, Grill, a random witch that comes to test Kirby at the end of the game. I looked further into Grill here to see if she was a reference to something else, but nope, she's completely original and's made minor cameos in future titles as stickers and stuff like that, but nothing substantial after this. But it's interesting to see that she's still referenced from time to time. This version of Kirby's Star Stacker was released for the Super Famicom in February 1998, making this the final Kirby game for this system. But there's one last game we have to cover to put a cap on Kirby's Super Nintendo era. Kirby's Dreamland 3, this time for the Super Nintendo. Released in November 1997, this would be the next installment of the Dreamland series and the second game in the Dark Matter trilogy. Kirby still had one last mainline game in the chamber, but Sakurai wasn't directing this one. Shinichi Shimomura of HAL Laboratory, who also directed Kirby's Dreamland 2, would take over director and lead designer duties for this title as well. This game begins with a peaceful day on Kirby's now named planet Popstar. So it looks like after Dreamland 2, Kirby and Gooey are good friends that go fishing together in their downtime. But suddenly, darkness appears in the sky, enveloping the planet in its tendrils. Somehow, dark matter returned. To make matters worse, the clouds it emits possess King DDD, his minions, and the citizens of Popstar, causing chaos around the planet. So Kirby and his animal friends step up once again to save the day. That's right, the squad, Rick, Ku, Kine, and Gooey return, which brings Kirby back to a simpler formula after the intensity of Kirby Super Star. There are 5 major levels to explore across Popstar as Kirby and his friends seek to free possessed citizens from dark matter's grasp. The gameplay is closer to the style of Kirby's Dreamland 2, with Kirby utilizing his animal friends to traverse these levels, but this time, 3 new ones join the fray. Nago the Calico Cat, who gives Kirby the ability to triple jump, Pitch the Bird, who doesn't fly as well as Ku, but has more combinations Kirby can use with his copy powers, and Choo Choo the Octopus, who sits on Kirby's head and... What's happening here? But seriously, the team combinations this time around are extremely clever, like the burning power allowing Choo Choo to float like a hot air balloon, or the spark power allowing Kirby to use a remote control to make Pitch fly around like a toy plane. There may be only 9 copy abilities in this game, but with all of these new animal friends, you're looking at 48 unique combinations. The animations are so detailed here and the sketch-like graphical style complements these characters' movements. But before we move on to the conclusion of this tale, let's talk about Gooey for a second. Gooey had a rather minor appearance in Kirby's Dreamland 2, but it's casually revealed within the manual for Kirby's Dreamland 3 that he's made from the same stuff as dark matter. He doesn't have an evil spirit though, so we're all good, right? Regardless, this is pretty interesting lore. But what is this stuff that they're referring to here?
Darkness.
Anyway, similarly to Kirby Super Star, this game supports cooperative gameplay, with player 2 being able to control Gooey, giving him similar abilities to Kirby, but instead he uses his tongue to swallow things. Kirby will encounter mostly new bosses in this title since we're saving possessed people this time around, like Acro, Pon and Kon, and Ado the Painter, who will paint the bosses from Dreamland 2 to attack Kirby. I thought that was really clever. The mainstays in the series, Wispy Woods and King DDD, return as bosses as well, but we know something much more sinister is at work here. So much like Kirby's Dreamland 2, you may receive a bad ending after defeating DDD, with Kirby just deciding to go home while poor DDD is having a stroke on the roof of his castle. You're supposed to collect 30 heart stars along your journey by completing very specific tasks, like not stepping on this tulip in the first stage, or recovering the lost shell for a snail, or defeating these Metroids in a cave for Samus? Oh my gosh, she even takes her helmet off for him. Is it confirmed that Samus and Kirby are in the same universe, by the way? Maybe there's a theory I can explore later. So with all the heart stars collected, Kirby can now enter level 6, the Hyper Zone, with all of his stars coming together to form this game's final weapon, the Love Stick. The game throws you right into a rematch with Dark Matter, which is very similar to their last battle, but with all of this love on his side, Kirby isn't going down. Happiness wins again and Dark Matter sits here exploding, but there's a plot twist. It's been this eye all along. Yeah, this thing is called Zero, and it's the creature that's able to create dark matter, which I'm assuming have been leaking out from his dimension into Kirby's. And if throwing dark matters at you wasn't enough, it decides to leak blood onto Kirby with slits in its eye. Yuck. And even when it's defeated the first time, it explodes into this bloody mess and this red inner eye pops out. This boss must have had some kids extremely anxious. But after relentless beatings from the Love Stick, Kirby defeats Zero and returns to Dreamland victorious, hanging out peacefully with all of his friends and King DDD, who looks like he's having an episode of social anxiety here. But with the day saved, Kirby has brought peace to Popstar once again, and with this final game, concludes his time on the Super Nintendo. Making this video has re-established my love for the Kirby series. I mean, there's so much care and detail in the games themselves, and even the spin-offs have like a certain amount of charm to them. And so far it's been a thrill to see this evolution happen from the very beginning. We head back to 1994, where Kirby, still relatively new to the gaming scene, has brought HAL Laboratory and Nintendo success. With 2 mainline titles and 2 spin-off games out at that time, Kirby seemed like a safe bet to capitalize on, with Nintendo ending up churning out several spin-off games, while Masahiro Sakurai, creator of the series, was hard at work on the next mainline title for the Super Nintendo. But while all of this was happening, Nintendo actually contracted a Western studio based in Scotland known as DMA Design Limited to develop a prequel game of sorts that would star Kirby in a much younger form. This is Kid Kirby, a Super Nintendo title for Kirby that would never see the light of day. And its developers, DMA Design Limited, would eventually become the folks that brought us Grand Theft Auto. You heard me correctly, this team was Rockstar North in its earliest form, with Kid Kirby actually being simultaneously developed alongside the very first Grand Theft Auto. So what happened to this game and what do we know about it? Most of the information in this video is compiled from recollections and details from former employees of DMA Design Limited. Unfortunately, there's no existing prototype of this game where we can see it in action, but I'll try my best to tell this story based on the facts that we do know. Kid Kirby stars a younger version of Kirby going on one of his earliest adventures. Believe it or not, a good chunk of the planned story was uncovered only a short time ago. Steve Hammond, the co-writer for Grand Theft Auto 1, would be in charge of Kid Kirby's instruction booklet, and courtesy of the Kid Kirby archive on Twitter, we're able to get a more detailed glimpse at the plot of this game. Welcome to Storytime with Mentok. Dreamland is a place so far away out in the sky that it would take weeks and weeks to get there, even if you ran all the way. When you arrived and you got your breath back, you would see this land of magic and mystery, enchantment and illusion. If you were lucky, you might even see a pudgy pink ball of cuteness called Kirby. If it was a long time ago, past last week even, you might have seen Kirby when he was very young, just a kid in fact. So it's confirmed this game takes place at least a week or possibly as far back as 1,000,000 years prior to Kirby's Dreamland. So make sure you all update your Kirby timelines. It was always bright in Dreamland, even the nights weren't too dark. And on this particular bright day, Kirby decided that he fancied having an adventure of some sort. He was still innocent and didn't realize that adventures could get a young pudge ball into all sorts of trouble. In the town square, all of the concerned oldsters were mumbling and debating about something that Kirby couldn't quite hear. They all seemed terribly bothered. So bothered, in fact, that they ignored him completely. And at this stage of the manual, I can tell they had no clue what this game was going to be about. Luckily for our young hero, he found a newspaper to let him in on the secret. The Dream Spring had dried up again. So based on this sentence, this has happened once before, and I'd like to see a game about that incident too. But the Fountain of Dreams drying up would lead into Kid Kirby's adventure. We even get a page featuring the newspaper article from the Dreamland Tribune. There are a couple of interesting plot points here, like people suspecting Prince DDD as being the culprit, who comes from a long line of suspicious characters. Yes, we would have seen King DDD's early days as a prince, which would have confirmed that he and Kirby have known each other for quite some time. Another detail within the article is this sentence: wilder notions point toward the Underworlders, which I can only speculate would have been either the major antagonist group for this title, or it's just a play on the paranoid conspiracy theorists in Dreamland blaming the incident on mole people. Other details from developers of the title would reveal that the Star Rod would have been stolen from the Dream Fountain, so I guess the major story beats here were heavily influenced from Kirby's adventure. In the manual itself, Kirby would have communicated to the reader in what they called Kirby's Kid Speak, which has a speech cloud with fruits and vegetables as the characters, as Kirby demonstrates the control scheme. Whether this language would have played a role within the game itself is anyone's guess. So this series of events would have also played out in the intro in-game, with Kirby waking up and emerging from his house to see all the commotion going on regarding the Dream Spring. So that's pretty much the only thing about the story, considering the developers have revealed that it wasn't really all that fleshed out yet. So what about the gameplay then? Is there enough here to figure out how that would have worked? Well, kind of. We know that the game was meant to be a very different style of platformer that would utilize the mouse peripheral for the Super Nintendo, the Super NES mouse. So this game control-wise would have worked much like Mario and Wario, where you kind of influence Mario's actions but not directly control him. It would also have been told from an older Kirby's perspective, reflecting on this adventure. Another ex-DMA design employee, James Watson, was one of the programmers working on Kid Kirby at the time, and on his old blog, he had this to say regarding the project. I was originally brought on the project to do the front end. We had some mental idea about having a 3D-ish rotating map, which never worked properly, and in the end we went with a photo album layout for the front end. The game was mouse-driven, allowing us to make the front end easy to use with large friendly buttons. We even had a cool Nintendo intro, with the logo embossed into the cover of the album that faded in. The book then opened to show the title page. The game was played with a mouse. You didn't control Kirby directly, instead you used the mouse cursor to grab his skin and pull it back. When you let go of the mouse button, he would go flying away in the opposite direction. You could also slap him upwards in flight or slam dunk him, useful for getting onto high places or into tight spaces, or transform him into various forms. It was probably one of the most unique gameplay ideas ever conceived, and I've not seen a game like it before or since.
Cap.
So the details on how and why Nintendo contracted DMA Design to create a Kirby game are somewhat sparse. But before the release of Grand Theft Auto in 1997, DMA Design was known for developing the Lemmings series, a level-based puzzle strategy title where the player must guide a group of lemming-like creatures through a series of obstacles and get them to the end of each level. So something happened in the middle of this and they ended up with a contract for Kirby. Maybe someday we'll know more and I'll be able to fill in the blanks here. But this is Mike Daly, the first employee and one of the 4 founders of DMA Design. Back in the early 2000s, Mike would share some of the concepts from Kid Kirby on his Flickr account, where we would get a sneak peek at some of the levels that were going to be implemented into the final design. We see designs for themes like a factory, caves, and a castle, but more importantly, the Fountain of Dreams, where many speculate would have been the location for the final boss. And while it's hard to fully grasp what the end product would have looked like based on these concepts, James Watson would confirm that the team were rendering graphics using SGI workstations, supercomputers at that time that were responsible for CG effects used in movies like Jurassic Park, but more relevantly, the workstations used to create the CG graphics in Donkey Kong Country. DMA Design would use the same methods as Rareware, rendering these graphics on the computers and then retouching them after the fact to make them usable for the SNES. So it's probably safe to say they were also chasing the Donkey Kong Country craze, much like many other developers at that time. Mike Daly would be contacted many years later through DMs by a Twitter user asking about the project. Hi Mike, I'm not sure if you respond to PMs, but have you worked on an SNES game known as Kid Kirby? Is there any version of this that was at one stage playable? Or was it simply a scrapped concept? Kirby was well underway, but took so long Nintendo got fed up with it and canned it. I did have an old demo, but it's vanished. It was designed to be a mouse game, kind of like Angry Birds. You pulled Kirby and stretched him, then pinged him in a direction to move around the level. The way my guy said his demo vanished, it's like somebody stole it from him. I can only cross my fingers that they find that demo someday. But Mike's recollection of the game seems to match that of James Watson's. Here's my best speculation on how this game would have worked. Looking at the level designs, they seem to be set up like a fancy maze board that you would see in those handheld toys that you move a ball around. In this case, the thing you're moving around is Kid Kirby, who the player would slingshot around the level by using the Super NES mouse, guiding him to the exit of each level while avoiding obstacles and enemies. While in flight, the player could slap or dunk Kirby to drastically change his direction, or use a set of copy abilities that would influence his trajectory. So all of these ideas kind of culminate in my mind as this interactive maze board with elements that you would see in Angry Birds and some things that we saw in Kirby's Dream Course as well, where you can influence Kirby's movements through copy abilities in air. And James Watson would mention on his Giant Bomb profile that the main game would have consisted of 120 levels, with about 60 of these being part of the main game, while others were secrets accessed via hidden doors in the levels. They would have also planned a 2-player race mode where players would have had to have competed to get to the exit first. The project is scrapped for several reasons. The DMA Design team was taking longer than Nintendo could stomach. They were also busy at this time working on the next Lemmings project and Grand Theft Auto, 2 games that interested the team more than Kid Kirby. On his Giant Bomb profile, James Watson has also said, quote, "This game was actually in development at the same time as Grand Theft Auto. Strange as it may seem, I was pulled off GTA and moved back to Kid Kirby, which at the time seemed like a bit of a come down, and was part of the reason I left DMA Design in the first place." Another reason the game may have gotten canned was due to poor sales of the Super NES mouse that was meant to be bundled with Kid Kirby. Dave Jones, another one of the founders of DMA, has said, quote, "It was to be a showcase for the SNES mouse, but the mouse did not sell that well, and the game was not great when played with a joypad, so it never saw the light of day." Despite all this, a small advertisement for Kid Kirby would reach only one publication, and that was Club Nintendo Mexico. This is where we would see this promotional art for the game. As for DMA Design, many of the employees and original members would leave the studio, while others remain at Rockstar North to this day. And perhaps the reason Kid Kirby never came to be was that they had their heads down on the original GTA, leading to the creation of this multi-billion-dollar franchise. So while that's all the information that we know about Kid Kirby, maybe the prototype will be rediscovered one day, and when it does, if it does, I'll be there for the follow-up. The serene planet of Ripple Star, home to these cute fairy inhabitants who live in blissful prosperity and are in charge of this poorly guarded crystal of unimaginable power. I mean, what could go wrong? Everyone gets swallowed into darkness, except this one fairy named Ribbon, who grabs their crystal of incredible power and flees into space with dark matter in hot pursuit. She doesn't get very far. Dark matter shatters the crystal and sends Ribbon plummeting down onto Popstar, the home of Kirby, and we get this scene where another celestial being happens to land on Kirby's head.
Oh man, not again.
The two become fast friends after Kirby realizes Ribbon's situation and helps her merge two of the crystal shards together, kicking off another adventure. But this time, we're in 3D, baby! Welcome to Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards, released for the Nintendo 64 in March 2000. This would serve as Kirby's official transition into 3D. Technically his first 3D appearance is in Super Smash Bros., but that's not what this video is about. We're continuing our journey to explore every game in the Kirby franchise, and there's 3 videos before this, so if you missed them, go get caught up, because this little limited series here might be a Netflix series someday.
Cap.
So with Kirby on board to help Ribbon collect all the crystal shards, we begin his new adventure as they journey off into the lands of Popstar. Even though the levels are now in full 3D, they play similarly to previous titles in the series, keeping the general flow of a 2D side-scroller. Kirby and Ribbon will journey to 6 unique planets, each with 3 or 4 stages and a boss battle. The Popstar levels feel like a condensed version of Kirby's Dreamland 3, as Kirby spends these levels saving possessed citizens of Popstar. Kirby takes on an artist character named Adeline, who looks and fights a lot like Otto from Dreamland 3. But apparently, they're not the same character. More on that later. And Kirby will also run into King DDD, who finds a crystal shard at the top of his castle. At first, he's reluctant to give it to Kirby, but Dark Matter uses this opportunity to possess him once again. How many times has DDD gotten possessed at this part of the series? I'm gonna start keeping count.
1, 2, 3.
But after Kirby defeats DDD and returns him to sound mind, he decides to join the adventure to find the crystal shards. Adeline and Waddle-Dee will also join the party, making this the final team to go and save the galaxy. So while Kirby and friends take off into the stars, how was this title developed? With Masahiro Sakurai busy on his new Super Smash Bros. Project and Kirby Air Ride, who at HAL was in charge of this one? We'll have to go back 3 years prior to 1997. HAL is already at work on their first 3D Kirby game before Kirby's Dreamland 3 is even released for the Super Nintendo. With 3D graphics as the new big wave in gaming, HAL wanted Kirby to follow suit. Takashi Saito was the project manager for Kirby 64, tasked with keeping a schedule for the development process. And at the same time, Shinichi Shimomura, known for his work on Kirby's Dreamland 2 and 3, would return to direct this title. The game was initially slated for the 64DD, a disc peripheral for the Nintendo 64 that was supposed to add a graphical and performance boost to the console. I discussed the 64DD in more detail in my Ocarina of Time video, as there are plans for Zelda content for this device as well, but still, due to poor sales in Japan, it would never see a Western release, and many of the games planned for it would just get a cartridge version instead. Kirby 64 was no exception. With Shimomura returning as director, similar themes from his previous games would return to Kirby 64, like the presence of dark matter, possessed characters, and Adeline, who was the reinterpretation of Otto from Dreamland 3. So quick tangent here. HAL has never directly addressed whether these two people are the same person or not. For Kirby's 20th anniversary, they released a special encyclopedia called 20th Anniversary Kirby Poo 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 Encyclopedia, and it addresses this confusion by discussing their similarities and stating Otto could be a nickname for Adeline, but no conclusions ended up being drawn here. According to WiKirby, Otto is rarely mentioned anymore, with Adeline being the only one referenced in the supplementary Kirby materials these days. But here's my headcanon. Perhaps Otto is this long-lost twin sister that Adeline smothered with a pillow in her sleep, and everyone in Dreamland has agreed not to talk about it. So RIP to Otto. Maybe we'll see you again someday.
You good, bro?
Okay, back to Kirby 64. Gameplay-wise, if you've seen other games in the series, Kirby 64 should be pretty familiar to you. This time, Kirby only has access to 7 copy abilities: Burn, Stone, Ice, Needle, Bomb, Spark, and Cutter. But here's the twist. You can combine abilities this time around. Suppose Kirby inhales 2 enemies with abilities he can copy. In this situation, he gains what's called a power combo, allowing him to utilize up to 28 combinations of abilities, like Burn Ice or Needle Spark. And assuming the enemy has an ability you can copy, the player can also obtain power combos by inhaling an enemy and spitting it out at another enemy. This creates an ability star that Kirby can inhale to get the power combo. While this game was initially planned to have multiple playable characters, the final game only has a playable Kirby, and to a lesser extent, DDD. King DDD is playable in certain levels and can use his hammer to knock down walls and other obstacles while Kirby rides on his back. Different levels will have Waddle Dee pilot certain vehicles for you as well, like the minecart and sled. As for the levels themselves, there are 3 crystal shards in each stage, and 1 for each boss, making a total of 74 shards that the player must collect throughout the game to get the final ending. So we return to Team Kirby, who have collected the shards from 5 other planets. Now it's time for Ribbon to return to her home in Ripple Star and deal with the threat of darkness. With her planet covered in dark matter's darkness and her friends and queen possessed, the team face off against the mastermind behind the dark matters this time, Miracle Matter. I can't tell what this is supposed to be, but I hope there's a D20 dice out there with this design. Miracle Matter takes on forms that are based on Kirby's copy abilities within the game, and it can only be damaged by using that specific copy power against it, which goes against everything I learned from Pokemon games, but after a trying battle, Kirby expels the darkness from Ripple Star, saving Ribbon and her people. And if you haven't collected all the crystal shards up to this point, the game ends, with Kirby and his friends heading back to Popstar as Ribbon and the Queen say goodbye. And just as Kirby is out of eyeshot, the Queen gives a blood-curdling glare to Ribbon as the screen quickly fades to black and the credits roll. Unfortunately, I never got to play this as a kid, but looking at this now, this actually gave me a slight chill. Alright, so clearly that's not the ending we want, so let's rewind. This time we collected all the crystal shards, which reveals that dark matter still possesses the Queen. Dark matter is expelled from her body and forms the final stage in Kirby 64, the Dark Star. Without hesitation, Kirby summons a warp star and the whole team heads off into the unknown. There's not much to the level itself leading up to the final boss, but it does show a couple of little clips of the team working together, which I thought was kind of cute. But it's in this level that Kirby will uncover the true mastermind behind all the events, Zero 2. No, not that one. Yes, this thing. A sequel to Zero from Kirby's Dreamland 3. It's now a bloody eye with wings this time. And much like the Otto and Adeline debate, we're unsure if this is the same creature as Zero, but I'd like to think it is, his form evolving after his crushing defeat in the last title. But those details aren't important because after getting stomped once again, Zero never returns as a plot device in future Kirby games. But I suppose if dark matter is ever around, we can assume Zero waits somewhere in a distant dimension, always watching from the void. The day is saved, for real this time, and the heroes are all awarded a piece of the crystal shard for their bravery. And the game ends with Kirby finally getting some play.
Oh shit!
So this ends the Dark Matter trilogy, with Kirby 64 being the last mainline title with Dark Matter as the primary antagonist, though this won't be the last time we see him. But after the release of this game, Kirby wouldn't be gone for too long, because I'm sure as you all know at this point, there's always a spin-off waiting just around the corner.
Introducing new tilt response technology. Now you move the Game Boy, not the buttons. Kirby Tilt and Tumble, rated E for everyone, only on Game Boy Color.
Kirby Tilt and Tumble was released in the US for the Game Boy Color in April 2001. The plotline for the game is pretty standard, with King DDD once again stealing the stars from Dreamland, but this time Kirby will flex once again by rolling through his entire adventure. So how could I describe this game? I suppose it's very similar to those handheld marble maze games, which coincidentally I compared the concept of Kid Kirby to in my last video. So maybe some of those ideas made their way into this game, though I have no way to fully prove that. But the game is a top-down view of Kirby this time, as the player would physically tilt their Game Boy Color to move Kirby around the stage. The game cartridge itself has a built-in gyro sensor that would detect the movements of the system, which for a Game Boy Color title seems way ahead of its time. The player could also flick the Game Boy upward to have Kirby jump over obstacles. There are 8 levels in total with 4 stages within each level, and red stars that must be collected in the stages to get 100% completion. And much like other Kirby spin-offs similar to this, there are boss battles to overcome in this format, as well as bonus mini-games the player can access, like Kirby's Burst-a-Balloon and Do the Kirby! I totally thought this said do the kinky. It's 4 in the morning, so cut me some slack. Nintendo would be the ones to develop Kirby Tilt and Tumble, but interestingly enough, Kirby wasn't originally planned to be the star. In an old interview with Insider, the director of Tilt and Tumble, Toshiaki Suzuki, revealed their initial idea for the game. Originally, the game was going to be called Koro Monkey, Monkey Tilt and Tumble, because we were using a monkey character. It's very interesting, but at the same time, we were still pitching several ideas around. While the monkey was quite charming, the emphasis of the game was not very character-oriented. We later decided Kirby would be a more suitable character for the game. Strangely enough, Sega would release Super Monkey Ball to the world a few months later. I'm not saying the two are related, but it's just an interesting coincidence. So back in 2001, IGN would also report that the game was almost rebranded as a Pokemon game for its Western release to cash in on the massive thirst for more Pokemon at that time. But ultimately, they backed out of that decision to avoid saturating the market. Either way, this was a small success for Kirby, becoming the 6th best-selling Game Boy Color game in Japan, selling over 500,000 copies. I suppose this response was enough for Nintendo to start working on a sequel for the Nintendo GameCube. At the Nintendo Space World event in 2001, Miyamoto himself demonstrated the gameplay for Kirby Tilt and Tumble 2. This time, the player would have moved around a Game Boy Advance that was connected to the GameCube through a link cable. The game would utilize both screens from the television and Game Boy Advance, with Miyamoto's demo showing Kirby fall off a ledge from the TV screen down onto the Game Boy Advance screen. And while initially it was planned for a May 2002 release, the game was scrapped. It briefly became a title called Roll-O-Rama, a version that had Kirby completely removed, replacing him with a regular ball instead. But shortly after this, the game would be cancelled. Seeing that the original Kirby Tilt and Tumble came out pretty late in the Game Boy Color's life cycle, there was a much bigger handheld project in the works for Kirby for Nintendo's next portable system, the Game Boy Advance. Nightmare in Dreamland, Kirby!
That shit is fucking trash, dog. Get the fuck.
Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland debuted in late 2002 for the Game Boy Advance, a complete remake of one of Kirby's most significant titles in the series, Kirby's Adventure. I covered the plot of this in my first Kirby video, but let's do a quick refresher. The citizens of Dreamland suddenly stop having dreams, and Kirby is no exception, so he decides to take the initiative and investigate this phenomenon, heading over to the Fountain of Dreams, a fountain that is the source of good dreams in Dreamland. And it's there he discovers that the Star Rod, the source of the fountain's power, has been stolen. King DDD is the culprit behind this theft, breaking the rod into 7 pieces and giving them to his minions to guard. So to fix the situation, Kirby rushes off to reclaim the pieces of the Star Rod and restore the Fountain of Dreams. So much like before, the objective is to jump from level to level, defeating the same bosses from the original game. And once he's collected the pieces of the Star Rod, Kirby returns to the Fountain of Dreams and retrieves the very last piece after defeating King DDD. However, after Kirby places it back on the fountain, there are consequences to his actions. DDD split the Star Rod to protect Dreamland from a dark force. Nightmare is released from the fountain, and he aims to wreak havoc across Dreamland. This leads to the final boss with Nightmare on the moon. But with the help of the Star Rod, Kirby makes quick work of Nightmare and destroys a good portion of the moon in the process. Man, Kirby is a menace in this game. But with Nightmare destroyed and the Star Rod returned to the Fountain of Dreams, peace returns to Dreamland. So overall, not much changed in the story here. But gameplay-wise, Nightmare in Dreamland is not just a graphically superior version of Kirby's Adventure. It has all the essential features from the original, like Kirby's 24 different copy abilities, all 8 levels, and the same bosses. However, seeing this as a brand new game engine, the gameplay is smoother, and many quality of life changes were made to the overall mechanics. There were also 3 new sub-games added called Bomb Rally, Kirby's Air Grind, and Quick Draw. And the player would have the opportunity to play these mini-games through optional doorways within regular stages, but they were also available from the main menu as well. You could even play as Meta Knight in an unlockable Meta Nightmare mode, though this doesn't really add anything to the story. It's more of a time attack option to complete the game as quickly as possible. Starring Meta Knight though, that's something, right? But the most significant addition to this remake is the option to play alongside 4 other players. Shout out to anyone who managed to get a 4-player session going when this game came out, because not only did you need 3 friends, but you needed 3 friends who had Game Boy Advance systems. And those 3 friends also needed to have bought this game. And those same 3 friends also needed to have link cables on hand. So maybe some of you had better luck with this than I did. But technically, you could play Nightmare in Dreamland with 3 other friends using 1 copy of the game, but you couldn't play the main campaign together. You were restricted to the 3 mini-games that were added to this game. So Nightmare in Dreamland would be the first remake for a mainline game in the series. So why did the folks at HAL Laboratory decide on Kirby's Adventure? Why not just make a brand new game? Well, around this time, a Kirby animation was airing in Japan and the US known as Kirby Right Back At Ya. Well, in Japan it was just Kirby of the Stars, which is the name of the Kirby series over there. But while this show was bringing in new fans to the Kirby franchise, HAL Laboratory had no new Kirby game plan to ship alongside the animation, and they agreed this wasn't a good business decision, so their time was limited. And instead of yet another spin-off, they had the idea to port an older game to the Game Boy Advance. Masahiro Sakurai, who at this time was the chief director of the Kirby series, initially suggested a port of one of the Super Nintendo titles, or an entirely new game. They abandoned the idea of a port, worried that audiences would view it as stale, and due to the currently airing animation, there was no time to develop a brand new game. So that left Kirby's Adventure as the game to remake, due to its solid balance for beginner and advanced players. Shinichi Shimomura will return as the director this time, teaming up with Sakurai on this project. There's an old Nintendo Dream interview from 2002 with Sakurai and the other developers, Eitaro Nakamura and Teruhiko Suzuki, who described their biggest challenge with the game was getting 4-player multiplayer to work. It was a brand new feature, and we had to work within the constraints of the original Famicom game, so it was very difficult. It was so hard getting the 4-linked GBAs to stay synced up. Even 1 to 2 months before release, it wasn't working properly. So one day we were having a meeting and Sakurai asks us, "Guys, is this really gonna work?" In addition to this, the team had other ambitious ideas they wanted to include, like a 4th minigame and a unique dance for Kirby for each copy ability. But due to memory limitations and time constraints, these ideas had to be abandoned. Despite the challenges in this crazy link cable orgy situation, Nightmare in Dreamland was a successful GBA title, selling just under 1 million copies. But this title would be the last Kirby game directed by Shinichi Shimomura. In fact, this guy would completely disappear from HAL Laboratory and the gaming industry after 2002. The fate of Shimomura is a topic brought up in quite a few Kirby circles, with speculation on where Shimomura could be now. Some speculate he was unhappy at HAL and left the gaming industry altogether to live a private life. Others believe that Shinichi Shimomura is just an alter ego for another prominent developer at HAL at that time, like Satoru Iwata, Sakurai himself, or Shigesato Itoi, who was responsible for the Mother series. Reading up on this almost sent me down an entirely different rabbit hole, but what's interesting is that there's only a couple of old pictures of this mysterious director from 1994. And this specific picture only made its rounds because somebody dug it up as recently as 2019. And it just surprises me that someone known for being involved in several influential titles for one of the most well-known gaming characters can just successfully spirit away like that. I'm not saying anyone should be hunting this man down, by the way, I just think it's a pretty fascinating mystery. As for Masahiro Sakurai, by the time Nightmare in Dreamland hit the market, he was 2 titles into his successful Super Smash Bros. Series. It was time to direct his next and final Kirby title.
If you can't beat him, eat him.
Kirby Air Ride for the Nintendo GameCube released in 2003. It's a racing title starring Kirby that can be kind of described as a kart racer, but I would say this game has some really unique mechanics that set it apart from others. Kirby races on his Air Ride machine, which starts off as a Warp Star, but there's other cool machines with different stats that you can use, like these wheelies. The game simplifies typical racing mechanics, and instead of holding down a button to accelerate, Kirby will just move forward automatically. Instead, the A button is used for a variety of things like braking, but if you hold down the brake long enough, Kirby will also charge up for a boost. The player uses the control stick to steer and maneuver, and during the race, can even inhale enemies to obtain copy abilities that can be used offensively. Surprisingly, there's no story for Kirby Air Ride, just 3 modes: Air Ride, Top Ride, and City Trial. Air Ride is the main campaign where Kirby will progress through 8 different courses and an unlockable 9th one, while collecting new machines that can be used in future races. Meta Knight and King DDD are the other 2 playable characters that can be unlocked during Air Ride mode. 3 other players can also join you in the races in this mode, and that's where the competition really heats up. Top Ride mode, I'm guessing, is probably the least played mode of the bunch. It simplifies the Air Ride formula and changes gameplay to a top-down perspective, and also minimizing the courses into these shorter laps. The objective is to be the first person to reach a certain amount of laps while avoiding obstacles on the track. I guess you can say the objective is the same in Air Ride mode, but you all get my point. The last mode is called City Trial, which isn't as polished as Air Ride mode, but I found this to be the most creative of the 3. The mode drops the player and 3 other Kirby clones, whether it's your friends or computers, into a more open environment. And your goal? Explore the area and collect other Air Ride machines or power-ups for your machine in a limited amount of time. Once time's up, you'll be pitted against the other players at the stadium in a race for glory. But while you're collecting these power-ups and other machines, your opponents can interfere with your work by stealing those power-ups or destroying your machine. Unfortunately, I never got to play this mode with friends, but I think it's a pretty awesome idea. Kirby Air Ride had Masahiro Sakurai's biggest involvement since Kirby Super Star. And as you navigate through these menus, you'll see a lot of assets, sound effects, and overall aesthetics are very similar to Super Smash Bros. Melee. Even the musical composers were the same. But similarly to Nightmare and Dreamland, Kirby Air Ride was built to be released alongside Kirby Right Back At Ya, and a racing game was chosen since it would take less time and resources than a brand new mainline title. But the development of this title goes even further back to the Nintendo 64 days. It would start as a proposed sequel to Kirby's Dream Course, entitled Kirby Bowl 64, with Kirby Bowl being the Japanese name for Kirby's Dream Course. There were 2 playable demos showcased for this proposed N64 game at the 1995 Nintendo Space World, with one demo having players control a ball-shaped Kirby through an obstacle course, and in multiplayer mode they'd be able to knock other players off the board. The other demo was a 3D snowboarding race where Kirby's boarding down a slope on a similar terrain to Kirby's Dream Course, grabbing stars for points. So these versions of the game would be cancelled, and as they reworked the concept, it would evolve into a racing game with an emphasis on drifting. Sakurai has mentioned that completing the course designs and art assets required a painstaking amount of work for the team, and even through this dedication, the game didn't feel right. This led Sakurai to make the difficult decision of rebuilding the game from scratch. But after they made this choice, they managed to complete the game in only 3.5 months. At the time of release, Kirby Air Ride sold 422,000 copies in Japan and 750,000 copies in the US, but was also met with some mixed reviews. With F-Zero GX released shortly before, and Mario Kart Double Dash slated for release later that year, reviewers saw it as, quote, the awkward middle child, with GameSpot going as far to say it felt like a bit of a throwaway due to its overly simplified gameplay. Despite all this, I see many Kirby fans look at this game positively, with many begging for some type of remaster or remake for modern consoles. And as for Masahiro Sakurai, this would be his final game at HAL Laboratory. It was tough for me to see that every time I made a new game, people automatically assumed that a sequel was coming. Even if it's a sequel, lots of people have to give their all to make a game. But some people think the sequel process happens naturally. If I want to keep producing games as a business, then staying at HAL would be a more stable place to do that. But I don't care about that sort of stability. Right now I'm far more concerned about the fact that the game industry, which is built from the balance between developers, publishers, and users, is beginning to fall apart at the seams. Shortly after the release of Kirby Air Ride, he stepped down as chief director for the Kirby series, going off to open his independent studio, Sora Limited, mainly becoming a contractor for Nintendo as director of the Smash Bros. Series and Kid Icarus Uprising. Please, Sakurai, follow up on that game. So with the creator and 2 significant directors retiring from HAL Laboratory, what the heck was next for Kirby?
When you're in trouble, call for backup. You can call on the powers of your new friends, unlock puzzles, defeat enemies, and gain new abilities in Kirby and the Amazing Mirror.
Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, released for the Game Boy Advance in 2004. But just for context here, this was the 3rd game that HAL Laboratory planned to cash in on while the Right Back At Ya animation was airing, even though it wasn't released until after the show concluded. The game begins with a giant mirror in the sky, introducing the concept of an alternate dimension to Dreamland called the Mirror World. Mirror World seems to be facing some threat, a dark entity that attempts to attack Dreamland. Meta Knight, who seems to sense this danger, flies toward Mirror World to handle the monstrosity, to keep Dreamland safe. Soon after, Kirby, who is just minding his own business, gets attacked by Meta Knight, causing him to split into 4 different Kirbys. You're not fooling us though, we know that's you, Kibi. Meta Knight just flies off, so the 4 Kirbys follow him into the Mirror World to figure out what the heck's going on. And so, our game begins. We find out that the Meta Knight that attacked Kirby was obviously an imposter, with the 2 Meta Knights fighting within Mirror World, but the Dark One is victorious and sends Meta Knight deeper into the realm, shattering the mirror in the process. We also get a glimpse of a dark version of Kirby wandering around, but let's not worry about him for now. The Kirbys have to collect the mirror shards to help Meta Knight and save Dreamland from whatever threat is at work here. And this game was the first new mainline title since Kirby 64, adding an interesting twist to the gameplay style. The adventure takes place on one massive map within Mirror World, home to 10 unique areas that can be mostly explored in any order. Rainbow Route is the start of Kirby's new adventure and serves as the bridge to many of the other areas within the game. Though it's the largest of the 9, it's the only area that doesn't have a boss waiting for the Kirbys. So the player will tackle the other areas Metroidvania style, collecting items and treasure chests like the Vitality Boost, which will increase Kirby's maximum health. But there's also maps and other goodies and collectibles as well in these chests. 4-player multiplayer makes a return, which is a really fun idea in this game because the players can take on the divide and conquer strategy, separating into different parts of the map and exploring each area separately. An item that makes a return from its cameo in Kirby 64 is the cell phone, which Kirby can whip out during multiplayer to request help from other players for puzzles or bosses, for instance. Kirby and the Amazing Mirror has 26 copy abilities packed in this time, with 6 new abilities making their debut in this game. There's Cupid, which allows Kirby to fly and shoot arrows, Magic, a single-use ability similar to Cook, which triggers a roulette with different effects like invincibility or summoning Meta Knight to take out enemies on screen. Then there's Master, an ability that allows Kirby to use Meta Knight's sword, Mini, which has Kirby become Mini Kirby, Missile, which is pretty self-explanatory, and Smash, which transforms Kirby into his Super Smash Bros. Counterpart, allowing him to use his abilities from the game, which I think is pretty awesome. Kirby and the Amazing Mirror also has brand new bosses that the Kirbys will take on in the Mirror World. Each one is an original boss except for Krako, which is basically tradition at this point. But for instance, instead of Wispy Woods again, Kirby will take on King Gollum, a stone tower within the abandoned Moonlight Mansion area. But my favorite inclusion is none other than Master Hand and Crazy Hand from the Smash Bros. Series, making their first and only cameo as a boss within this series. This feels like a game directed by Sakurai, but HAL Laboratory would outsource development this time around to other studios, Flagship and Dimps. Flagship is somewhat of a subsidiary of Capcom, responsible for helping out with early Resident Evil titles and fully developing games like Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Seasons, and Oracle of Ages. Dimps is a well-known Japanese independent studio that has developed several Sonic handheld titles and Dragon Ball games. So these teams together made Kirby and the Amazing Mirror happen, using assets from Nightmare and Dreamland as a jump-off point. And though Sakurai departed from HAL Laboratory at this stage of Kirby's timeline, he was still involved as an advisor to this project, which would explain some of the Smash Bros. Cameos within the game. In fact, the idea for this game came about during a meeting in 2003 between Sakurai and Flagship's president at the time, Yoshiki Okamoto. But by crazy coincidence, they'd both leave their companies before the project moved forward. So HAL Laboratory would contract Sakurai after his departure to see the project through. So with that said, let's bring our story home. The Kirbys managed to collect all the mirror shards, dealing with the occasional run-in with the Kirby doppelganger walking around and the fake Meta Knight in one boss encounter. But once they deliver all the shards to the mirror where Meta Knight is trapped, the portal is restored and they head into Dimension Mirror, where Meta Knight awaits. Just kidding, it's Dark Meta Knight. Damn! And Kirby takes him on once again in this final epic battle. But it's not over yet, as another portal appears where more evil awaits. And Kirby jumps right in with the real Meta Knight offering his help by tossing Kirby his sword. And so the true mastermind behind everything is revealed, Darkmind. This is the thing who is attempting to control Mirror World and whose evil is leaking into Dreamland. Kirby will have to fight this guy 4 times across multiple stages, but like many other Kirby bosses, this brutish form is just a front to something much more menacing lying beneath. After Kirby's 4th win, the true Darkmind emerges.
Come on now, dawg.
Yep, it's another evil eye. The appearance of this thing is often compared to Dark Matter, but I see more of a resemblance to Zero. I'd even venture to say that Darkmind is the mirror version of Zero, lurking within his own dimension within the mirror dimension. So once you beat this form, Darkmind will attempt to flee, and Kirby will hop on his Warp Star to finish the job. The craziest part about this battle is that Kirby takes this ass whooping into the credits. Yes, while the credits roll, the player can just keep mollywopping this thing. Can someone in the comments let me know if any other game has done this before, because none come to mind right now. So after the credits roll, the game ends with the Kirbys bringing peace to the Mirror World, while this Dark Kirby is revealed to be the Mirror World Kirby who was supposed to be protecting it in the first place. Why weren't you doing anything this entire game? And another thing, this game ends with all 4 Kirbys heading back to Dreamland. So is Kirby officially 4 people now? Am I supposed to assume that if there are multiple playable Kirbys in future titles, they're the ones from this game? Alright, let me not think too hard about this. Kirby and the Amazing Mirror sold 620 copies by 2006, slightly less in comparison to Nightmare and Dreamland, but the critics gave it pretty positive reviews. The game currently has an 80 on Metacritic, 1 point less than Nightmare and Dreamland. But if I were to recommend any Kirby game on the Game Boy Advance, it would be Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. Mainly because they set out to try a new formula, and it's the only new mainline title on the system before we start getting into the Nintendo DS era of Kirby games.